Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Associate Professor Duygu Yengin from School of Economics and Public Policy at this university, and I'm honored to be your MC for today's 2025 Joseph Fisher Lecture, hosted by the School of Economics and Public Policy at the University of Adelaide. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Ghana people, the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us this evening. Tonight's program will open with the welcome speech from Professor Fiona Yap, Head of School of Economics and Public Policy. After that, I'll be making an introduction of our keynote speaker, Senator Barbara Pocock, AM, who will deliver the keynote address. The evening will conclude with a question and answer session, offering the audience a chance to engage directly with the senator. To formally welcome you on behalf of the university and the school, I now invite Professor Yap to the stage. Please join me in welcoming Professor Yap.
Thank you, Duygu, for that very kind and gracious introduction. I too wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I wish also to acknowledge all First Nations persons who have joined us today and pay my respects to them. Very warm welcome to our speaker this evening, the Honorable Senator Barbara Pocock. I also wish to acknowledge and welcome our distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends, including Professor Jody Conduit, and you have to bear with me, this is a long title, Pro Vice Chancellor-elect at Adelaide University and Executive Dean of the College of Arts, Business, Law, and Economics at the University of Adelaide. Mr. Andrew Manson, Chief Economist, Department for Energy and Mining, South Australia. Mr. Greg Raymond, Executive Director, Revenue and Economics, Department of Treasury and Finance. Mr. Jason Higham, Manager of Conservation and Threatened Species, Department for Environment and Water. Ms. Katie McClusker, our Chief of Staff for Senator Pocock. Professor Fermin Doko Chatoka, Associate Dean of Research at the ABLE faculty. It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to the 2025 Joseph Fisher Lecture. Joseph Fisher was a distinguished South Australian businessman, legislator, and philanthropist, known for his honesty and straightforward approach to economics and political affairs. He believed in the importance of integrity and transparency, qualities that remain essential today. The Fisher Public Lecture is one of the most significant events in our academic calendar, and the lectures have been offered annually or every 2 years since 1904. It honors the legacy of Joseph Fisher, who is seen as one who acts on principles and not self-interest. The Joseph Fisher lecturers to date have been a mix of prominent economists in academia and government, senior politicians including 3 prime ministers, and influential Australian bankers and businessmen. More than a dozen of the past lecturers appear in Who's Who in economics. 13 were knighted, and 2 have been awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics. Most have shared Joseph Fisher's interests in liberal markets and small, non-interventionist government. To date, only 3 females have given a Fisher lecture so far, a reflection probably of the gender bias until recently. Therefore, we are immensely delighted to add tonight's speaker, Senator Barbara Pocock, AM, to the list of high-achieving women who continue to cut a path for all of us. Senator Barbara Pocock, AM, is graduate of the School of Economics and Public Policy, University of Adelaide. She's a leader in economic research and public policy and has dedicated her career to advancing fairness, transparency, and social justice. She's not cutting an easy path for the rest of us. Her work in Parliament investigating government accountability, workplace rights, taxation, and housing resonates deeply with the Fisher Lectures. The topic this evening, economics, ethics, and power, reflects the urgent challenges facing our society, from growing inequality to housing stress, and from workplace change to questions of public trust. These issues demand more than economic analysis. They require ethical leadership and a clear-eyed view of power dynamics. I thank you all for being here today to engage with these critical questions. I hope this evening inspires thoughtful discussion and a renewed commitment to shaping a fairer and more ethical future. I invite Associate Professor Dwi-gu Yengin to now introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Professor Yap, for your warm welcome. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Senator Barbara Pocock, AM. Senator Pocock is widely regarded for her deep expertise in labor markets, gender equity, and economic justice. After earning both a Bachelor of Economics with first-class honors and PhD from the University of Adelaide, she built a distinguished academic career, founding the Center for Work and Life, and also published influential studies that have shaped national conversations about work, care, and inequality. Since her election as a senator for South Australia in 2022, Senator Pocock has been a tireless advocate for fairer workplaces, affordable housing, greater government transparency, and fairer tax policies, as well as climate. Issues at the heart of public debate today. She was appointed a member of the Order of Australia in recognition of her significant contributions to industrial relations, gender equity, and education. Senator Pocock is uniquely placed to speak to tonight's theme, economics, ethics, and power, drawing from her academic research and her experience on the front lines of policymaking. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Senator Barbara Pocock.
Thank you so much, Georgienne, and also to Fiona for your warm welcome and for the warm hospitality of the students of your school and of the staff today. I felt that we had a very rich discussion, and there is nothing that is lacking in the education and assertiveness of students in this university in the field of economics. Thank you everyone for being here, citizens and distinguished guests. I acknowledge with everyone else that we meet on Kaurna land, and I pay my respects to Kaurna elders and to all First Nations people who are with us. Aboriginal sovereignty was never ceded, of course, and in South Australia, as all over our country, First Nations people lost control of their land, their water, their livelihood. They lost so many loved ones to illness, to massacres, and to a frontier war, one that began in South Australia with whalers and was continued by pastoralists for decades after the 1830s. Many of North Terrace's most majestic buildings and biggest bequests, including of this university, bear the names of these pastoral and mining families who owe a great debt to First Nations people, like we all do, and the losses they suffered as great fortunes were wrung from lands long in the custodianship of First Nations Australians. This was a raw, unequal and unforgiving economics of power which we are obliged today to understand and to remediate. In this lecture, I want to ask how an ethical economics can help us navigate the challenges of our times, and I want to do this by first making some comments about economic theory before moving to its current practice in dealing with some of our big challenges. I want to draw out some lessons for economics students and for our democracy. This lecture as we have heard, honours the legacy of Joseph Fisher, who died here in Adelaide in 1907. He lived just a few streets from where I do now. He was an accountant, a board member of many significant South Australian enterprises, a politician and a respected figure in South Australian public life. He was said, as we've heard, to be plain-spoken and did not put his private advantage ahead of principles. He lost his Legislative Council seat in 1881 because he refused to support a bill that restricted Chinese immigration. He thought it was unchristian, and he paid the price for sticking up for his principle, promptly lost his seat. I hope he would approve, at least in part, of my focus tonight, which touches on the questions of principle and of vested interests in public life. I came to Adelaide Uni in 1972 as a country kid who had just spent 2 years after high school working in shearing sheds and on farms around Australia and New Zealand. I was motivated by a single question. I wanted to know why some people got rich while others stayed poor. Questions about inequality loomed when I left the farm and all its security behind and arrived in 1979 after 4 years in this university with my degree in hand to work at the Reserve Bank. This was 46 years ago. I was very lucky as a student of economics in this university. I was taught by people who changed my life, and I see Sue Richardson in the audience. You've been at my shoulder as I've written this speech, Sue, so I'm terrified. But it was not until I had climbed over a lot of rather tedious technical training in my first 3 years of undergraduate study to arrive at honours. So for anyone in the room who's currently in that 3-year period of torture, hang in there. A good future lies ahead. Best of luck. It was only in my honours year that, after being trained in those neoclassical tools of supply and demand and statistics and national accounts and so on, that we turned to the big issues of inequality, values, and the underlying assumptions and competing theories of economics. My teachers, led by Professor Jeff Harcourt, loved their field. You felt that they made you excited about it, and they were excited about it. They talked about real-world problems. They disagreed with each other. They made you laugh, and they expected the best of you. Our classes were very small. I was, by 4th year, very glad I had enrolled in economics, and I wrote my 1978 honours thesis about economies of scale in mallee farming, and much later, my 1997 PhD about the construction of power, male power, in trade unions. I love the clarity and elegance of economics tools, and I especially love their potential to peel back cover stories and self-interest and to reveal those interests, to collect data, to put evidence to work, to follow the money, to analyse winners, losers, and to lay out and evaluate options for a better policy. Economics can also be put to bad use. It can ask trivial questions, mask self-interest, collect bad data, and manipulate good data. As the queen of social science, it throws its weight around, and it's often used to authoritatively trump other arguments in debate. It's a powerful discipline. However, the social factors that affect its findings are not always clear. I remember, for example, a moment in my microeconomics tutorial 48 years ago when my tutor, and I think it was Peter Kenyon, explained that if equal pay was implemented for women, it would cost their jobs, as microeconomic theory told us that the increased wages would exceed their marginal productivity. Gender pay equity was bad for women in this account. I was not a confident student. I was a country kid, the only woman in my honours year, but I put my hand up and asked, but what if women's wages were currently depressed below their true marginal productivity because discrimination meant the market was not in a price-clearing equilibrium? If this were true, equal pay wouldn't cost women their jobs. It would just mean fair pay and less profit for their employers. As it turns out, this is a better explanation of what actually has happened to the gender pay gap as it's narrowed and women's paid employment has grown so significantly since the 1970s. The same could be said to be true these days of junior rates or the low or no pay that Aboriginal labour received for much of last century. Unless the social realities of discrimination are brought into the analysis, low pay for these less powerful workers are rationalised by microeconomic theory as sensible, protective policy. Microeconomic theory of wage fixing only works if there's a perfectly functioning labour market, free of discrimination, with perfect information, perfect mobility, and all of the conditions that are essential to perfect competition. That's quite a long list, and most markets in Australia don't meet them. Sometimes it takes a woman or a young person at the back of the room who's not receiving equal pay to see it. In my experience, the dominant form of neoclassical economic theory taught in our university departments and dominating policy making in many of our government institutions, including our parliament today, is too often put to work concealing vested interests rather than revealing them. This school of economic thought places deep faith in markets as trusted, self-correcting institutions that should be left to their own devices to allocate scarce resources. Critics point out that neoclassical economic theory solves trivial problems in a precise way, while turning its back on the big questions that preoccupied classical and what are now often referred to as political or heterodox economists, like the accumulation of wealth, inequality, power and poverty. So my first rule, and I've got 8 rules, for young economists to think about these days is to ask big, important questions, to not be seduced by the precision and comfort of asking and answering small ones, ones that don't matter very much. Far from places of clinical precision and uninterested resource allocation, markets are places where muscular economic and political interests are expressed, reinforced, protected and enlarged. They bury the questions of power, inequality and wealth to focus on technical questions of mere distribution, with the market the favoured tool of distributional choice. A narrow focus on the mechanics of exchange on prices and markets obscures questions of distribution, inequality and power, of what people bring to markets. When we approach markets to sell our labour or to buy a home, we do so from very different platforms of relative wealth and social power. While markets help sort out prices, they tell us little about the resources we bring to those market exchanges, so different according to our social conditions, our gender, our age, our race, our family background, our physical health and ability. Further, neoclassical economic theory diminishes the problems of market failure. In our world, these are far from trivial insignificance. They arise from the concentration of corporate power, so evident across the Australian economy in our banking, supermarket and resources sectors, which are amongst the most concentrated in the world. There are important consequences arising from these concentrations. They affect pricing, profit, and they create powerful aggregated economic interests that have political expression, including in the media and in our parliaments. They mean that a banking royal commission that finds criminal activity doesn't result in conviction or prison for white-collar bank thieves, while a nurse who cheats on her tax will be shown little mercy and a bank robber none. So rule number 2 for me in economics is always follow the money. Understand whose interests are served underneath the cover story of economic theory. 2 other failures of dominant economic theory are also very important rules for economists. The first of these relates to our environment and the over-reliance of an extraordinarily inadequate and misleading GDP measure and all that flows from its perversions. Our toxic algae bloom will reduce GDP through the loss of oyster sales and tourism, but it will be boosted by millions spent on coastal cleanup and the building of artificial reefs. This theoretical model treats environmental damage as a positive contribution to GDP and a mere externality to the main game of economic production. So rule number 3 is don't forget the environment and nature. There is no economy on a dead planet. This really matters in a country that is the second largest exporter of fossil fuel CO2 emissions in the world. These exports are measured with enormous positive effect in our national accounts and GDP. However, the science is clear. There should be no new fossil fuel development of the world. There should be no new fossil fuel development in the world if we're going to stick to the warming targets of the Paris Agreement, temperature rises of 1.5 degrees. Yet the Australian and the South Australian government continue to foster and approve new fossil fuel exploration and production. And our universities continue to take their donations, even as our country is reeling with a climate crisis through bushfire, floods, massive insurance hikes and ocean warming. But coal and gas is a double win for our GDP, as our fossil fuels boost exports while the costs of insurance and mitigation boost the GDP. One of the great lies at the heart of economic theory is the pretense that economic production is not wholly dependent in the long run upon a healthy planet. Without a healthy environment and climate, there simply cannot be an economy. It's that simple. However, the vested interests of the fossil fuel industry are hard at work in our economic analysis and our parliament. They make massive donations to the big political parties. Many ex-politicians line up their post-parliamentary mining or banking industry sinecures before they even leave Parliament. And these mining giants, which pay so little tax, have very influential hotlines to governments. This is vested interest at its peak. Our kids don't have the Prime Minister's phone number to make the call to include a climate trigger as part of decisions on new fossil fuel projects like Woodside's Northwest Shelf. If economic theory was doing its job, it would be mapping the national and international economic costs of these decisions and the people they fall on. Future generations, poor people around the world, citizens of the Pacific, and those who were dealing with floods, drought, ocean damage, when we are long gone. They'll be picking up the tab. We know the solutions on climate change and we have the tools we need to implement. We must put the interests of those who follow us before the interests of a small group of fossil fuel profiteers who are determined to wring the last fortunes out of its extraction while putting our futures at risk. This takes me to another and important and useful rule for economists, my rule number 4, to ask whose voices are at the table, shaping the questions and the contours of analysis, and whose are missing. And what of the world of work and of production? I spent most of my working life putting my economics training to work researching the world of work. However, in this world, neoclassical economic theory ignores the central question of the power imbalance between one who sells their labour and one who buys it, as well as the power imbalances arising from workers' age, gender, skin colour, or care responsibilities. In this world, unions are seen as corrupting the clean functioning of the labour market, making wages sticky, and conservative politics has worked hard for the last 35 years to weaken them, and it has succeeded. Most importantly, this dominant economic theory focuses on the world of production, beneath which lies the great iceberg of social reproduction. That is, who has, raises and cares for children, the workers of the future. Another of the great lies at the heart of economic theory is the pretense that economic production is not wholly dependent on social reproduction. So rule number 5 is without social reproduction and care, there is no economy, and we must pay attention to it and the conditions of that work and the gender of who does it. It is the case that too many of our leaders, including in Parliament, are, in Keynes's words, the slaves of some defunct economist, and have shaped economic policy upon that great lie that our economy is not built on care. How else can we explain the fact that great inequities like the persistent pay gap for gender and the failure to meet women's workforce participation with free, quality, safe childcare for our kids and our parents and our communities? I became a labour economist because work is a place where inequality is made and where it can be unmade. It's a place where the clinical application of the neoclassical tools of labour supply and demand just cannot explain things. They can be helpful, but without analysis of social factors, power and institutions, economists are scrambling for useful explanatory footholds. So a vital rule, number 6 for me, in fact, for any economist who wants their discipline to be of use to people in the real world, is to excavate and lay bare the values and assumptions that lie at the core of any economic analysis. It's clear that economics is often privileged in our political debates. It's used to close an argument with authority, sometimes regardless of an analysis being deeply flawed or, not uncommonly, purchased by an economic interest. I witnessed this very early in my Senate life at a Senate inquiry, my first, which heard evidence from the Master Builders Association. They relied on a study they had commissioned from the Big Four consulting firm EY. My first encounter with EY, not the last. It emerged that EY modelling of the productivity costs of eliminating the Australian Building and Construction Commission used assumptions laid out by their client, the MBA. This included relying on survey results from 49 out of a possible 350,000 business respondents about their guesses on productivity losses resulting from industrial action. EY's small print in the report said that the study considered, and I quote, only the interests of the client and made no representations as to the appropriateness, accuracy or completeness of the report for any other party's purpose. End of quote. Certainly not for the Senate's use. In other words, we senators were witnessing the work of a hired gun, retailing an argument they'd paid for, which embedded their assumption and used shonky data. Every year, many academic researchers give evidence to parliamentary Senate committees. They're not paid for it. It robs their teaching and their research time, and sometimes they're insulted as they do it. I certainly have been. And this morning I heard evidence at an inquiry into the forthcoming penalty rates bill with academics from Sydney Uni doing exactly this, speaking in a personal capacity as professors to give their time and research findings to the Senate for free. We are in the debt of these economists who do not take a check for their results or contort their analysis to give the clients what they want. That's a further rule for young economists. Don't lie. Tell the truth. Don't compromise your analysis for money or status. Examples like that of the MBA have led think tanks like the Australia Institute, where I have been a director, to point to the lack of professional standards for economists and for a code of conduct for economic modellers. Too often economics is treated as a technical discipline, clean, mathematical, reliable in its detached independence. And the past 30 years have seen a massive mathematisation of economics. While this is not without benefits, I am reminded of one of my favourite economists, Joan Robinson, who usefully explained the true purpose of economics thus. The purpose of studying economics is not to acquire a set of ready-made answers to economic questions, but to learn how to avoid being deceived by economists. Parliament needs to remember this purpose. Every parliamentary submission or appearance, every budget decision, every tax policy, every workplace reform reflects assumptions, values and choices. And this reinforces my 7th rule, which is to act ethically. This rule was brought home to me so many times in the Senate over the past term, 3 years, around the role and behaviour of big consultants. Many young economists spend time employed in one of the big 4 consulting firms, and we had one of them in our classroom today. They want to work for EY, KPMG, PwC and Deloitte. Indeed, it's historically been considered an elite posting that will open career doors, proof that you can cut it in the fast-paced, long hours world of the towering temples of accounting and advisory firms that dominate the skyline of almost every big city on our planet. Just look down the road to where Deloitte's Neo signage overshadows our parliament. A perfect illustration of my point. I've now spent a great deal of time in the world of the Big 4. The consulting scandals began in early 2023 when it emerged that PwC partner Peter Collins and his colleagues had energetically misused confidential information about proposed tax changes affecting big multinational tech companies, which they monetised as advice, earning millions in fees for PwC. Since then, we've learned a great deal about their business model, working conditions, structure, ethics, tax practice, and their massive expansion into government work. And several things really stand out. Firstly, we've witnessed a massive hollowing out of our public sector. Australia's spending on consultants is amongst the highest in the world. In 2021-22, the Morrison coalition government ran a shadow public service worth $20.8 billion in a single year, the equivalent of almost 54,000 public service jobs. Public funds have been paid for poor work, for no work, for work of very poor value, or contracts that include super profit margins of 50 and 60%. We have wasted billions of public funds which could have provided services like housing, health and education. The second standout truth is the astounding level of greed we have witnessed. These very large advisory and audit firms are long-term advocates of privatisation. However, their work is extremely expensive and their top salaries are absurd. For example, Luke Sayers, who was CEO of PwC throughout the many years of the PwC ethical failure, 8 years in fact, though he denies any knowledge or responsibility for what went on on his watch as CEO, he was paid over $30 million between 2012 and 2020, with a peak of $4.5 million in 2019. It is clear in these enterprises that a very dense set of relationships exists between individuals in large consulting firms and some in our public institutions. There's a very active revolving door as individuals move between big consultancies and the public institutions and departments. The Big Four actively map, though they denied it on transcript in Hansard, that they do map workplaces, but they clearly map possibilities in government departments and they actively farm opportunities for from the public purse to capture policy, to capture institutions, and most importantly, to capture the dollar. State capture weakens our democracy, it sidelines the public interest, it impoverishes the state, and it weakens citizens' confidence in our democracy. Then there's the question of donations to government. The Big Four donated more than $4.3 million to the ALP and the Coalition over 10 years between 2012 and 2022. They secured $8 billion in government contracts over that same time, a very fine rate of return. It's hard to argue that direct donations to government do not create the perception and or the reality of straightforward corruption. We have seen evidence, in addition, of many extraordinarily amazing, shocking conflicts of interest. Firms advising government on aged care service standards while assisting their aged care clients to meet those very same standards. Firms advising on national climate policies while their client lists include the world's biggest fossil fuel producers. Existing regulation of big consulting firms and their business models and opaque partnerships has failed. These very large partnerships are inadequately governed. ASIC has made clear that it regulates, in their words, just a sliver of the activities of big consultancies which do not face the transparency, tax, or other regulatory requirements of Australian corporations. They don't pay corporate tax. Finally, aggressive business models have contributed to poor employment practices inside the Big Four, affecting thousands of Australian workers and their families. Economic graduates looking to work in big partnerships should read both the Sikorsky review of PwC and Elizabeth Broderick's review of EY. The evidence is alarming. Bullying, racism, sexism and harassment, with long working hours being a critical issue, negatively affecting the health of 46% of EY employees. The aggressive pursuit of revenue has overridden ethical practice too many times, and it's clear these will not be tamed by codes of behaviour, inconsequential penalties, brief suspensions of access to contracts, or even politicians' outrage. We need deep structural reform or we're going to find ourselves back here again. This past week, it's been revealed that the Department of Finance has decided to readmit PwC into government consulting, having been locked out by mutual agreement since April of last year. PwC's readmission to government work is against the explicit recommendations of our multiple parliamentary inquiries into PwC. We said that PwC should not have access to government contracts till all the investigations into its activities were complete, and these include activities that are live now by the Australian Federal Police, the ATO, the Tax Practitioners Board, and I've personally referred them to the National Anti-Corruption Commission. They're all underway, and yet they're back in the trough. We three senators who led these inquiries, members of three different parties, Liberal, Labor and Greens, signed a joint letter to the department last week saying that this decision sent the wrong message to industry and was premature. We were ignored. You might ask, what is the use of Senate inquiries? Good question. Amazingly, the federal government has no powers to bar a consultant from government work, no matter its performance or ethical breaches. So a culprit has to agree, as PwC did, to not contract rather than be barred. A debarment mechanism exists in WA, and I give notice to you tonight here that it's the Greens' intention, my intention, to attempt to introduce a similar power for Commonwealth procurement law. It is overdue. All of this is a cautionary tale for those economists who work in these large consulting firms or work with them. Behaving ethically is a challenge if your governing business model, chasing income, is reinforced by the partners above and the workers alongside you that drive bad behaviour. Unfortunately, we could paper these walls with written codes of conduct from these firms. They are wizards at ethics washing. And too often, the brave whistleblowers inside and out, and there are many good people inside these firms, who call out unethical behaviour end up themselves on trial, pilloried and suffering along with their families. We need much stronger protection for these brave souls. Without them and persistent investigative journalists alongside them, along with the occasional senator, there would be no inquiry. There wouldn't have been any inquiry into consultancies, into PwC, nor into banking or robo-debt or aged care or so many other issues. I might say the PwC scandal did have one very positive consequence. It sold enormous numbers of the AFR. The two journalists who pursued this and really excavated the question, Ed Tadros and Neil Chenoweth, won a Walkley for their work, and I know that they were congratulated many times by their editors for the extraordinary amount of money their stories generated. Everyone loves a good financial scandal. History tells us that crisis can fuel structural economic reform, and successive scandals over the last decades have created powerful arguments, sometimes momentum in favour of reform. But too few have delivered long-term structural change. We lock up many more Aboriginal children under 13 than we do unethical bankers or consultants. In too many cases, these crises pass with too little change. From the beginning, PwC expressed hope that their crisis would pass, public scrutiny would end, and so it has done despite multiple inquiries. They hope for a short public memory, for weak government, and they hope for distracted politicians who go on to something different. Throughout all of this scandalous chapter, I've felt at my shoulder an ordinary nurse, earning around $90,000 a year, paying 25% in tax, nowhere to hide in a pay-as-you-earn tax system. That tax going, perhaps, towards payment to a big consulting partner for overpriced contract work, sometimes restructuring that very nurse's hospital or aged care job. Meanwhile, the Big Four leaders earn between 2 and 4 million plus bonuses a year and aggressively minimise their tax. To paraphrase F. Scott Fitzgerald, the very rich captains of consultancy are truly different to you and me and to that nurse. Fortunately, this crisis has also shown us how much Australian citizens care about these issues and their appetite for change. Australians want a parliament and a government free of capture by the big, greedy organisations, and they want a public service that doesn't go soft on dishonesty. Since joining the Senate, I've seen how fragile our democracy is and how powerfully our tools of economic analysis can be deployed to support or undermine it. Big consultancies, big oil and gas, big banks, big property developers, they all wield disproportionate power and they cultivate strong relationships with elected and non-elected officials. They fund scare campaigns, they rotate through government, they lobby ministers, they shape legislation, they're not elected and they influence the elected. We see all of these things in our current housing crisis. My generation have had a lot of advantages. We have lived mostly on a safe planet. We had free uni education, decent, secure work. Perhaps the greatest of our good fortunes has been affordable housing relative to our wages. Today, many young people in insecure jobs have sizable HECS debts, pay huge rents, and can't see when they'll be able to buy a home. If we're honest in our economic analysis, we know the solutions on housing. They aren't that complicated. You would not think so, reading the financial press. For the past 3 decades under governments led by both major parties, housing has become an asset for the purpose of wealth accumulation, not an essential building block for a decent life, not a human right. We have failed to build enough public or community housing, and indeed our state governments have sold much public housing, and we have let rents run wild, except in the ACT where they're capped. We've allowed unlimited rent increases in a world where renting is now much more common and prolonged. It's not a brief life stage. With falling rates of home ownership, a rental property drought and rising homelessness, we are experiencing a real crisis in housing that's changing the lives of so many people. This crisis is a result of deliberate policy design. A completely cooked housing market is the result of John Howard's 50% capital gains tax discount piled on top of negative gearing to deliver billions in foregone tax benefits to the pockets of wealthy property investors who outbid first home buyers and turbocharge housing prices. This has distorted investment, diverting it from productive activity into housing speculation, and it's pushed up house prices. We need to end housing investment tax breaks that deliver, for example, 82% of the capital gains discount to the top 10% of earners, an even more perverted set of tax incentives than the stage 3 tax breaks, which really were a standout. These tax breaks will cost our budget $165 billion in foregone revenue over the next 10 years, according to the Parliamentary Budget Office. That's a lot of affordable houses, a lot of teachers and nurses. Fortunately, support for housing tax reform is growing, with the ACTU, ACOS, some banks and many Australians knowing from direct experience that this is all wrong. However, one does not have to scratch very hard to find a library of analysis, much of it from the Big Four and led by vested interests like the Property Council, arguing that the sky will fall if we interfere with these distorting tax settings. They argue instead for cutting red tape and for deregulation, which would no doubt make developers' lives a little easier and conveniently top up their profits. Sadly, building lots more high-end houses and apartments that are likely to be bought by investors with tax breaks will not fix the housing crisis. We need social housing and affordable options that are near the jobs and services that ordinary families need. Of course, if we can build more quickly, if we can use new technologies, increase the skilled workforce we know we need, then all of that will help. But none of these are enough without cooling off the demand of wealthy property investors and building the right kinds of social and affordable homes in the right places. So to summarise, we need a different conversation about economic justice and inequality. Our policymakers must use economics to reduce inequality, not to entrench it. Our democracy is increasingly challenged by vested interests who capture our parliaments. These actors pull strings from above, often in ways that are opaque and unaccountable. Too often they wield and weaponise economic analysis to authoritatively dominate economic debates, including through the hired guns from big consulting firms. Many people want change. We are a wealthy country, and the 48th Parliament is the most progressive in my lifetime, with a progressive Greens party and balance of power in the Senate. We can create progressive revenue streams to fund what we need and to make choices that don't leave people behind. We can act more like Norway, which taxes their fossil fuel industry and gives their kids free university education, instead of giving away for free more than half of the gas we export and charging our kids a fortune to go to uni. We must ask, who is our economy really working for? And we must insist on peeling back those values, assumptions and cover stories of analysis and govern in the public interest. Our discipline of economics can help, but it will require an economics that follows a few rules, and I've given you my top 7. Ask big questions, follow the money, pay attention to the environment and the care economy, notice whose interests are running the show, act ethically and tell the truth. Good luck to any young economists in the room in applying them, and I hope that Joseph Fisher might have agreed with a few of them. Thank you. You're over here.
Thank you, Senator, again for this compelling lecture. We will now move to our moderated Q&A session. To start the conversation, I'll ask a few maybe light-hearted questions, and then we'll go to the audience questions. So, Senator, to start with, who are your favorite economists today, as well as maybe in the past, and why?
And why? Oh, well, I did have some notice of this question just in case you think I carry in my head all the time all the names of economists that I love. But I think my favourites at the moment include certainly Mariana Mazzucato, who wrote an amazing expose of the Big Four in the UK. If you ever want to have your hair curled by scandals in the UK, then her book is definitely worth a read. And of course, Stephanie Kelton, who at University of Adelaide has played a real role in bringing her to Australia and laying out the principles of modern monetary theory, which I found very fascinating. If you ever want to see a good economist communicating, my God, she is brilliant. And someone I've recently discovered is Isabella Weber, who has been really amazing in the post-pandemic times in analysing institutions and the way in which inflation was created in such a different form than previous cycles of inflation. She talks about sellers' inflation and big corporations and how profit has created inflation this time rather than a wage price sort of squeeze. So they're some of my favourites. But yeah, if I was going to have dinner with some economists, I would love to have dinner with Jeff Harcourt. That would be fun. But yeah, I reckon I'd love to have dinner with John Maynard Keynes and Joan Robinson would be fun. And maybe we could rehabilitate Karl Marx and see how that went. That'd be my favourites. Yeah.
Thank you. So, as an academic and as an educator, I want to ask, what topics would you like to see more of in economics education today? And are there important questions that economics is currently overlooking?
Well, if the students that we met with today are any indication, I know some of them are in the room, they're asking excellent questions. Is a PhD of any use? Great question. I won't give my answer to that here publicly, but, try and get a topic that's relevant to something and publish on the way through. But yes, we need much more positive contributions from economists on the questions of housing and on inequality, and certainly in relation to the very big costs coming at us out of climate change.
So, next question is about women, their role in leadership and in economics. Mary Robinson recently said that putting more women in leadership is key to positive change. What are your thoughts on this, and how does it relate to the field of economics?
Well, I'm so glad that there are so many women leaders in the University of Adelaide Economics School now. This is a very fine achievement because it changes the questions that we ask, it changes the way we do analysis, and it changes the culture of education in institutions. I'm not essentialist, not all women are saints, but women make a difference, and women have certainly made a difference in the federal parliament. It doesn't matter what party you're from, the climate within the Senate is made different by a really significant number of women there. Assertive women, variable levels of talent, no doubt about it, but I am incredibly grateful that every day there are people in that chamber who've got 2 children, 4 children. Their lives are real and they've had to deal with all of those things and they bring those interests to their policy making and law making. And we really owe them a big thanks.
Now, I'm sure the audience has also plenty of questions, so let's open the floor and keep this conversation going. So please raise your hands and the microphones will reach you.
Thank you very much. Wonderful lecture. In the present climate of, or the immediate political climate of the domination of the productivity question, I wondered if you care to comment on whether our main economic problem is production or distribution.
Well, I'm not sure our main economic problem is actually either of them right now. For me, the main economic problem is how fast climate crisis is coming at us and how much it's going to cost us. We have a major report given to the government late last year, which the government has not put on the public record, which we understand from newspaper reports has extremely concerning news about the cost that is going to be here it's here now. It's here in our state right now, from damage to water, to oceans, to our food production, to many aspects of production. So that would be my most important issue. But in terms of the economic roundtable next week, I think it's been a good thing to surface a public discussion about what kind of country we want to be, what kind of tax regime we want, how are we going to raise tax and what should we be spending money on. And it's good to see questions of the care economy surface there, and also to see, a lot of institutions, as I said in my talk, are really paying attention to who benefits and who loses out of different tax systems. So I also, and we've gone out today, the ACTU has said today that their number one topic for the roundtable next week is to reduce working hours. They've got a range of ways it could happen, extending periods of leave, additional rostered days off, or reducing the length of the working week. I think we've got to talk about distribution of productivity. And if you look at the last 10 years, the rate of profit has moved at twice the pace of the rate of wages increase. So I think the Australian workforce has a dividend there that it deserves in terms of reduced working time. And I hope that's going to get a bit of a Guernsey, but then I'm an optimist.
Thank you. I was really interested in your comment about social realities. I've spent most of my working life on the STEM side of the house, and I've moved over to fuzzy sciences lately. But even in STEM, history tells us the foundations on which a theory or a model or the people working in it were doing their stuff, and the technology that was available. Sociology is the operating system that was running at the time. Philosophy asks the question, should we be doing this? Given we've had a recent win with the 20% discount for people's HECS fees, what's the chances the Morrison government's changes to humanities might get reversed? But also the really weird way funding for postgraduate courses is done, in terms of that some are hexable, some are not. It depends on it seems like someone puts a pin in a map to decide who gets what on that, because our generation were the first ones where you went from job to job. This generation now, they're going to be in continuous education for the rest of their lives.
I can't answer for whether Labor will roll back those appalling changes that really struck hard at humanities, but it's very clear they should, and there is a lot of support for them doing so. They're being, the Prime Minister at least is very clear on the public record. He won't do anything that he didn't set out clearly in the election as a mandate, and my view is he has a mandate to be more ambitious. I think his Treasurer would like him to be more ambitious, and I think there's plenty in higher education who think that's one thing that needs fixing, the mistreatment of humanities through those Morrison reforms, but also more broadly the question of funding of our higher education system. I'm serious about saying our higher education should not be, our research and our buildings should not be built by oil and gas. They should be built by public funding in the public interest, and there are consequences of having, I've run a research centre for 10 years. I tried to, like running a small business. You're desperate for funds, but we need to fund our research properly through the public purse for public interest. And people who want to give money, corporations or big organisations, pay your taxes, and we should tax you properly to that end.
Senator, first of all, I'd have to say I'm very pleased that somebody with such a sharp mind is in our federal Senate, so thank you for that. It seems to me that so many of the issues you raise, and even the first two questions there, are rolled into the thing we call corporations and proprietary limited companies that seem to have rights and privileges that we humans don't seem to have. The people are able to hide behind these things, and that the laws that govern them, these are things, are entities, they're not humans, but those entities seem to have power beyond the ability of our laws to keep up with them. You know, there should not be the case that a money can buy a vote. You know, that's our system. We created it. It's to serve us. An entity should not be able to damage the planet. You know, it's our planet, and every other piece of nature's planet, yet a corporation can continue to damage it without any way of us preventing it from doing so, from stopping it. It's that commercial law, that corporate area, the social responsibility of these entities that seems to be so much of the problem in that they are lacking in those responsibilities.
Well, and we have a responsibility too to elect governments that govern them properly, and we don't at present. I think you're absolutely right. We have extreme concentration in some of our most significant sectors, absolutely in banking and supermarkets in particular. But we also have problems in the non-corporate sector. I mean, the big four are not corporations. They are partnerships with, up to 1,000 partners. The principle of partnership is you can sit in a room and you can all agree on how much debt you'll have and what strategically you'll do next year and so on. These partnerships are ungoverned. They don't pay tax, so we need to renovate more consistently big entities, and we need to manage the way our parliament interacts with them, whether they're corporations or big partnerships or other forms. We spend a lot of time on ASIC and how they work, but ASIC has no say in the very important parts of our economy, and it should. But yeah, we have this morning, the Commonwealth Bank, $10.2 billion annual profit, 4% increase in profit. And I spent the morning listening to Senate evidence in a hearing about employers who want to roll back penalty rates affecting the lowest paid workers in our country, including in the finance system. There is no end to the voracious appetite of the corporation when you think about the way it affects the lives of too many low-paid, especially women, lots of young people. But yeah, class struggle is real, and we need to govern it better.
From your experience of being in Parliament, what has been a pleasant surprise to you and what has been a shock to you?
So many. I think the pleasant surprise is how real and positive relationships can be across parties. I have loved that. And not all my Greens comrades love that, but I don't do my politics by shouting. I try to have interaction. I think that's what people want me to do. That's the way I'd behave in my house. Why wouldn't I behave like that in the Senate? I don't like screaming, and I do like genuine discussion about policy. And there are so many opportunities for that in our Senate. It's an incredible privilege. Yesterday, I was in the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Audit and Accounting, looking at how we audit defence. How do we know that billions of dollars going into particular asset purchases are being spent the way they're meant to be spent with the right outcomes? I mean, that's a massive task. And we need really good committee structures and people with good relationships. And no one sat in that committee yesterday with Greens written on their head or Liberals or Labor. There are certainly people who make points about it, but there are people who actually want to manage their public accounts properly. And I have really liked, and I've made good friends. We have all been so shocked about the consulting stuff that we are as one on the scandal and the way it should be dealt with. On the negative side, was that the other part? What's been the biggest shock? Oh my God, it's just so... You're not allowed to say this. My kids tell me I'm not allowed to say this, but it's really hard work. It's really hard work. You are away from your home half the year, and too bad, if you have a grandchild or, Anyway, the days in Parliament are absurdly relentless. They're more than 12 hours a day and they are really full on. And it's not good for government. I've done enough research on long hours of work myself to know that the hours of Parliament are not appropriate. But I do think the level of governance of ourselves in the Parliament is improving. We had some shocking behaviours that really needed fixing. We still need to fix long hours of work for workers and make sure we treat our staff properly. That is a challenge for lots of people who find themselves suddenly a senator and have never managed a staff before. Suddenly you are the boss of 7 people in their lives, and plenty of us stuff it up. So, there's a lot of challenges.
What do you think is Australia's role in the global world? There's a huge inequality globally as a result of colonialism, capitalism, and Western imperialism, and this manifests in very different social, economic, and environmental burdens. So, how can Australia leverage its privilege to address some of these global inequalities?
Yeah, thank you. Amazing question. Impossible to answer in a few minutes, but the biggest inequalities in our world are between countries, much larger than the inequalities within countries. And we are, a very internally focused population, but we have a big contribution to play, and we need to make sure our governments actually play it. And I think in the last 2 weeks we've seen people on the street who have changed a government's position on Palestine. So my model of political theory, didn't talk about that tonight, but is that you cannot change much in the parliament unless there are things happening outside it. One of the reasons we're in such a mess environmentally is our environmental organisations are too passive and have not created enough radical possibility to the left of parliament. That's my reading of it. And are very glad to be taken into the drawing rooms of policy making rather than really push for the things we need to save our planet. But I think the same applies to our role internationally. When you look at governments like the Fraser government or the Hawke government, for example, in relation to South African apartheid, they, from the Australia that we live in, pushed for international financial sanctions. Hawke and Fraser led them. They made them happen. We cannot do what we've been doing for the last year and nearly 2 years and fail to take our own leadership as, a middle power. So we have a big challenge here, and we don't do enough in our aid budget, and it is really alarming to look at how we're growing our defence budget. That's a whole other story, but yeah, what you raise is a really important issue.
Okay, trying. Well, thanks for the talk. That was really interesting. I'm not an economist, but I hear the economics that come on the media, and you hear about what goes on in Parliament and policy and so on, and it seems like a sports match. It's all about wins and losses, competitive edge, getting an advantage over your opposition, and yet that's kind of not how human society works. There's a role for cooperation, and that's certainly part of our economy, but you never hear it being really talked about by economists. So I just wonder if you've got any thoughts about that.
Well, it's such a big issue, isn't it? How do we have a functioning democracy that can meet the big challenges we face rather than do, warfare across the aisles between major parties and crossbench as well? I think the voting patterns of Australians are really interesting at the moment. If you look at the fact that, the fall in support for major parties is incredible, and people are responding to, I hope they're responding to what we do in the Greens, but they're clearly responding to the presence of more women who speak with their own voices in the Teals. I don't agree with all the things the Teals do. They're a diverse group. I would like them to be stronger, and I would like them to take stronger positions on employment and housing and climate. But they are getting that whole crossbench shift is a significant change in Australian politics, and I think it's partly a response to that big party bickering, which has not really solved most of the major problems we have, and indeed has left us with some really big problems like housing. We've had 30 years of economic growth, longer actually, and here we are, with this terrible legacy for our next generation.
Thank you, Senator Pocock. This morning on Radio National, our Premier, Peter Malinauskas, was interviewed in relation to the algal bloom crisis. Always talked about as an algal bloom crisis, not a climate crisis. Very swiftly, the attention turned to the economic costs of the algal bloom on industries and tourism. Any tips about how we tip the balance so that the costs to nature and our lives are the things on the balance sheet, not whether you can buy bait or have an Airbnb holiday on the south coast?
Yeah, it's a pretty narrow frame and it's incredibly short term, isn't it? When you think about the work that scientists in this institution and in other universities that have been pointing to ocean warming for some time. And here we are, you know, all shocked and suddenly visiting the beach for 11 minutes in the case of Murray Watt, now back today for another look. You know, it's not good enough. It is a national disaster. These words cannot come out of Murray Watt's mouth. They have not yet come out of his mouth. There's a whole lot of rubbish semantics happening. And the really significant price is under the waves. And the scientists are telling us it is really serious. These massive coral bleachings we've seen in the last 10 days, really, really recently, very unexpected, huge. It's all happening faster than the scientists thought. And we need leadership, including from our state premier, which is more long-term. And I actually am in favour of looking after economic interests of people who've, you know, suddenly found themselves without any income for many months. But, you know, there are a lot of producers in our state economy who have that circumstance through drought, for example. The daughter of a Mallee farmer, I know what that's like. It's terrible. You have no income for more than a year, 2 years recently. So climate change is causing enormous costs. Some of it is under the radar. And this is a big role for our economists to properly pull into public view the true cost of the warming of our oceans and all the other things that are coming at us very hard in our climate change crisis.
Hello, Barbara. I might have a little bit of trouble framing this, but I wonder why socially we allow housing to be owned by... There isn't a law that limits the amount of assets that one entity can own. It seems a social economic sort of genocide that I don't know why us as the constituents don't have more power over this, and it's a conflict of interest within governments that seem to allow this. I'm not sure how to frame it any better.
Well, actually, what we're doing is a lot worse than that. We're actually paying billions of dollars in foregone tax revenue to assist wealthy property investors to buy more property. We're not just letting people own a lot of property, we are subsidising them into owning that property. So our sins are multiple as managers, and it is extraordinary that we have allowed this to happen. And as I said in my talk, it is a deliberate policy design. It's had consequences that weren't all expected, but they can be fixed. The true test for us now, for Labor in particular, because we're ready to assist, is to recognise the crisis that we have and take the actions. Now, there are a whole lot of different policy proposals that can be done around negative gearing and 50% tax breaks for negative gearing, for capital gains tax. And they're currently being ventilated, which is good. Some countries put a limit on how many properties you're allowed to own, you know, recognising that housing is not an asset class, it's a roof over the head. And I think we need to look at some of those proposals. But the first thing we should do is stop paying people. You can, we have a Greens policy which says, of course, your own home is exempt. You can own, in our policy, an investment property. And after that, you can own as many as you like, but you have to pay tax. You have to pay the same tax as that nurse. No special deals. The ACTU proposal is that grandfathering of all existing properties, which have, you know, all legally been purchased, most of them probably, for 5 years, and then at the end of that 5 years, you get your assets in order, expecting that you will lose that tax or both those tax benefits in 5 years. Others have come up with other ideas. We're reverting to the arrangements that pre-existed John Howard's change. There's a whole lot of things that could be done, more or less radical, but clearly we have to do some things fast, or those tents and those women in those cars all around our city are just going to keep growing. And that's kids are being raised in those places. And we are going to, and our generation will be paying for their education, their remediation, their imprisonment down the track because of the nature of the childhoods and lives they're experiencing.
Oh, one last question, please.
Okay. Thanks, Senator Pocock. Firstly, I have to express gratitude that we have someone with your values and courage representing us in Parliament. So thank you for your work.
Thank you. Thanks, Dane.
It seems clear to me that vested interests have a disproportionate impact on policy development. How do we get big money out of both politics and also the media?
Yeah. Oh, you know. And this was the bit I should have said about what shocked me most about the Parliament has been, you know, you go into the Parliament as a serious person hoping to affect your country. But my vision of what those parliamentarians are doing right now, and I'm one of them, is above us are a whole set of strings and phone calls and players who we don't even know who they are. And they certainly aren't the ones donating money or lobbyists. They don't need lobbyists, and they aren't paying those few million. They have relationships that circumvent all of that behind closed doors. So I have a sense of a set of puppet strings for our Parliament, and we have a relatively healthy democracy. Of course, there are many, many worse examples around the world, not least the US. I'm not sure how we fix all of that. The media is definitely a major problem, and we now have very significant forces right out to the right in advance who are putting big money into capturing outcomes. Certainly they did on the referendum, and they played a role, quite a significant role in the last election, and we need to be running investigations on where their money comes from and where it goes, because they interfere with democracy and that is their purpose. And they use social media extremely effectively. So we need to be managing our social media and our political communications. Truth in advertising is important, has to be effective. We have to fix the funding of elections and the donation systems. And we need to, for example, have clarity and openness about diaries, who's meeting what and who, and, you know, those kinds of things. Very, very important. A range of things that could be done. On the concentration of media, I don't know the answer, but it is definitely a very significant problem because everyone in that big house is very focused on how the Australian is going to present them tomorrow, or how the Fin Review is going to present them, and all the other forms of media which no young people ever read. But, you know, the politicians pay attention to the way they are treated in those dailies and that media, traditional media. Job for all of us.
So to close the questions, I want to ask one. So do you have any advice for young economists, economic students, how they can use economics as a tool for good to make the world a better place instead of working for the money?
Oh, yeah. Well, I tried to say that today, what I thought. You know, you're in the labour market a long time these days, and I think the most important thing is to find good workmates and a good boss and move on if you've got a bad one. I'd say that to anyone of any age because your life's created by a bad boss in a bad way. But I think also trying to get that alignment between what matters to you and the work that you do, because that is petrol or battery charge every day for you in what you do. And when you look back on your career, you will think about the people you worked with and the times that you tried to make a difference. Even if you didn't succeed, a lot of us don't succeed. It's the trying that matters. Thank you. Thanks for the question.
So thank you, Senator, for sharing your valuable insights and experiences with us tonight. I think your reflections on economics, ethics, and power have given us much to consider and inspire. I also like to thank everyone for your attention and thoughtful questions. On behalf of the School of Economics and Public Policy, we extend our sincere gratitude to you for joining us. I also like to thank Professor Fiona Yap for her support and welcome, and Professor Judy Kundit, our Executive Dean, for her leadership and encouragement in making this event possible. And a special thank you to the staff working behind the scenes, Corinne, Jocelyn, and May. As we close, I encourage you to carry forward the ideas and challenges we had explored this evening, and to consider how each of us can contribute to a fairer and more ethical economic future. Safe travels home, and we look forward to welcoming you back next year for the Joseph Fisher Lecture. Good night.